The first reports reached the outer listening stations of the Terran Union as faint distortions in deep space traffic, long-range gravitic ripples that did not match any known civilian or military transit signature, and at first the analysts treated them as routine anomalies caused by pulsar interference or old wreckage drifting through unstable hyperspace corridors. But within hours, the pattern repeated across 3 separate sectors, forming a slow advancing arc that pointed unmistakably toward human-controlled territory. And in the Situation Room on Luna, Admiral Richard Hale stood in silence while the tactical holograms sharpened and the artificial intelligence finished stripping noise from the data, revealing the unmistakable mass shadows of a fleet so large that even conservative projections placed it at several thousand capital ships, each one displacing enough energy to power a continent. And around the table, the senior commanders of Earth's Navy watched as the models updated, their expressions calm but their eyes calculating. Because this was not the first time an alien power had tested the edges of human space, but it was the first time one had moved with such overwhelming confidence and such open disregard for concealment, as of announcing to Galaxy that resistance was either irrelevant or already accounted for, and far beyond the walls of the command center, the political leadership of Earth was being briefed with the same data, the same cold numbers, and the same conclusion that the approaching force belonged to Korlathi Dominion, a civilization that had ruled a quarter of the inner spiral arm for over 1,000 standard cycles, a species that had built its empire on the doctrine that only strength deserved survival and only dominance guaranteed peace. And in their long history, they had encountered dozens of younger races, each one judged, classified, and either absorbed, subjugated, or erased based on its perceived threat potential. And in every case, the process had followed the same pattern: an initial show of force, a demand for submission, and if that demand was not immediately met, a brief and brutal demonstration of what refusal meant. And now that ancient machine of conquest was turning its attention toward Earth, not because humanity had challenged it, but because in the endless expansion of empire, all borders were temporary, and all neighbors were eventually measured for usefulness or elimination. And in the towering command spires of the Korlathi homeworld, the High War Council observed the same projections with expressions that their species' equivalent of calm, a collective confidence born of centuries of unbroken victory, and their supreme strategist, a veteran of 12 successful planetary pacifications, spoke in a voice that carried the weight of unquestioned authority, stating that the human territories lay on a critical junction of trade and hyperspace corridors, that their industrial output was impressive for a species barely emerged from its cradle, but that their military doctrine showed a reliance on outdated concepts of mass fleets and linear defense, and that their psychology, drawn from intercepted cultural transmissions, suggested an emotional species prone to hesitation and internal division, and therefore ideal candidates for swift subjugation. And when one junior analyst cautiously noted that human technological development had been unusually rapid, and that their recorded history showed a pattern of extreme adaptability under threat, the chamber dismissed the concern with a ripple of low-frequency agreement, because in the Korlathi view, speed of progress meant nothing without the depth of tradition and the ruthless unity that only a warrior civilization could sustain. And so the order was given without ceremony. The armada would proceed, the outer human systems would be taken, and the species would be presented with a single choice: compliance or extinction. And back in human space, as the realization of what was coming spread through command networks, there was no panic broadcast, no dramatic speeches sent to public, only a quiet shift in operational readiness, shipyards increasing output, reserve fleets being quietly activated, and long-dormant defense protocols moving from theoretical planning to live execution. And in a secure briefing room beneath the surface of Earth, a small group of officers and scientists reviewed contingencies that had never been tested in open war, systems built in secrecy, strategies designed not for border skirmishes, but for the kind of existential conflict that determined whether a species would have a future at all. And as the first Korlathi forward elements crossed into the fringe of human-monitored space, their commanders already saw the outcome as decided, viewing the scattered human patrols as insects before a storm, unaware that every signal they transmitted, every formation they adopted, and every tactical assumption they made was being recorded, analyzed, and quietly folded into a response that would, in time, force the entire galaxy to reconsider what it meant to underestimate humanity. The Korlathi vanguard advanced with ritual precision, their vast wedge formations sliding through hyperspace emergence points like the blades of a colossal machine, each ship broadcasting dominance codes on open channels in a language translated instantly by Terran systems, messages that did not bother with threats so much as statement of inevitability, informing all human authorities that the Dominion had arrived to bring order, that resistance would be categorized as irrational, and that compliance would be rewarded with continued biological existence under Korlathi administration. And in the early hours of that first contact, civilian traffic was quietly rerouted, outer colonies placed under silent evacuation protocols, and the human response remained deliberately muted, not because of fear, but because the planners in Luna Command understood that the Korlathi expected emotional reactions, political grandstanding, or hurried defensive posturing, all of which would confirm their psychological models, and so instead the Terran Union allowed the first probing actions to unfold with minimal visible resistance. Patrol cruisers shadowing the invaders' extreme range, sensor drones drifting in patterns that looked random but were in fact feeding a constantly updating combat simulation that ran millions of iterations per minute, and in the Korlathi flagship, the Supreme Strategist observed the human units on his displays and interpreted their behavior as caution, bordering on paralysis, concluding that the species was attempting to assess the scale of the threat before committing, a natural but ultimately futile instinct in the face of overwhelming force. And so he authorized a limited demonstration, a single task group detached from the main armada, directed toward a lightly defended mining system whose primary value lay not in its resources, but in its proximity to several major human trade routes. And the objective was simple: destroy the orbital infrastructure, neutralize local defenses, and transmit the result across all channels as proof of the consequences of defiance. And when the Korlathi warships dropped out of hyperspace near the system's primary gas giant, they encounter a handful of human frigates and an aging defense platform, assets that by Dominion standards barely qualified as military. An engagement that followed lasted less than 12 minutes. The Korlathi energy lances tearing through shields and hulls with clinical efficiency, the human vessels fighting with disciplined coordination, but lacking the firepower to alter the outcome. And when the last defense platform fell silent, its reactors venting into space, the Dominion commanders transmitted their victory footage unedited, confident that the sight of human ships burning would shatter morale and accelerate surrender talks. But within the Terran command network, the battle was dissected not as a defeat, but as a data set, every weapon discharge, shield fluctuation and maneuver recorded and compared against predictive models, revealing patterns in Korlathi targeting priorities, power distribution cycles, and formation response times, and in the quiet rooms where strategists worked without ceremony or speeches, conclusions began to form that the Dominion's technology, while formidable, was optimized for fighting opponents who conformed to predictable doctrines of mass and symmetry, civilizations that met force with force in the same, geometric patterns that had defined interstellar warfare for centuries, and humanity, with its history of asymmetric conflict, decentralized command philosophies, and willingness to sacrifice conventional elegance for functional advantage, did not intend to fight on those terms. And as the Korlathi armada continued its steady advance, secure in the belief that the first blow had landed and the psychological pressure would soon yield diplomatic capitulation, the Terran Union initiated the next phase of a plan that had existed only in classified simulations, a plan that assumed the enemy would be larger, stronger, and more technologically advanced, but also assumed that such an enemy would be bound by its own traditions of war. And in the depths of Earth's shipyards, vessels that had never been publicly acknowledged completed their final readiness checks. Crews briefed with minimal rhetoric and maximum clarity, told only that the coming engagement would define humanity's place in the galaxy, and that failure was not an acceptable outcome. And across dozens of systems, seemingly routine logistical movements masked the repositioning of assets, the seeding of deep space with autonomous platforms, and the alignment of command structures designed to operate even if central authority were disrupted, all while the Korlathi Supreme Strategist prepared the formal ultimatum that would be delivered once the Armada reached the threshold of the inner colonies, confident that by then the humans would have seen enough to understand the futility of resistance and the wisdom of submission, unaware that every step of his carefully ordered campaign was being allowed, even encouraged, to unfold because it was drawing the Dominion deeper into a battle space that had been shaped in advance for a very different kind of war. And as the distance between the Korlathi's spearhead and the first major human core system narrowed to a matter of days, the tone of their transmission shifted from declarative to instructional, outlining procedures for planetary compliance, the surrender of orbital control, the handover of military command authority, and the integration of human governance structures into the administrative hierarchy of the Dominion. And these messages were delivered with the same detached certainty one might use when describing a routine engineering process, because to the Korlathi mind, the absorption of a lesser species was not an act of cruelty or malice, but a natural and efficient reordering of the cosmic hierarchy. And in the Terran Union Assembly, representatives listened to the translated statements in silence, not because they were cowed, but because the real decisions were being made elsewhere in secure command loops where political considerations gave way to survival calculations. And there the conclusion was unanimous that negotiation under these terms would only delay an outcome that the Dominion had already decided, and that the only path forward lay in forcing the Korlathi to confront a reality they had never truly faced, an enemy that would not conform to their expectations of how a weaker power should behave. And so when the Dominion task groups began to encounter isolated losses, a patrol cruiser vanishing in a region of supposedly empty space, a sensor platform going dark without a recorded engagement, these incidents were initially logged as mechanical failures or navigation errors, because the idea that the humans had begun to strike back in a meaningful way did not fit the prevailing assessment. And yet in the operational analysis rooms of Luna Command, each disappearance was marked as a successful micro-engagement, the result of long-range kinetic ambushes, electronic warfare traps, and autonomous strike systems that operated without broadcasting their presence, systems designed to exploit the Dominion's reliance on centralized control and predictable formation integrity. And with each small, deniable loss, the Korlathi advanced slow by fractions of percent as commanders adjusted routes and tightened security. So changes that were themselves fed back into human models to refine the timing and placement of the main engagement. And when at last the Dominion armada reached the boundary of the Epsilon Eridani system, a heavily industrialized hub whose shipyards and logistics depots made it a critical node in human space, the Supreme Strategist ordered the fleet to deploy in full assault formation, intending to make the capture of the system a decisive demonstration that would break any remaining hope of organized resistance. And as thousands of warships maneuvered into their assigned vectors, their reactors flaring and weapon arrays aligning with mechanical precision, the human defense forces revealed themselves not in a single mass fleet, but in layers, a dispersed network of strike groups, fortified orbital platforms, and mobile artillery arrays that had been positioned not to hold territory in the traditional sense, but to channel the enemy's movement into carefully calculated corridors of engagement. And in the first moment of the battle, the Korlathi opened fire with the full weight of their long-range batteries, beams and projectiles crossing millions of kilometers in seconds to smash into human outposts and defensive nodes, and the initial exchange appeared to confirm every assumption of Korlathi superiority. Shields collapsing, structures fragmenting, and human vessels retreating or being destroyed under the onslaught and the command spy of the flagship. The Supreme Strategist observed these results with a measured satisfaction, noting that the enemy was reacting exactly as predicted, absorbing losses, falling back, and attempting to preserve core assets, and he prepared the next phase, the close engagement that would annihilate the remaining defenders and secure the system, unaware that the apparent disintegration of the outer defense layer was not a failure, but a calculated sacrifice, a control withdrawal designed to draw the Dominion's main formations into a volume of space where the true human counterstroke could be unleashed. And as the Korlathi fleet surged forward, confident in their momentum and in the inevitability of victory, the first elements of that counterstroke began to activate silent networks of weapons and platforms that had waited years for a target worthy of their purpose. And in that moment, as the battle expanded and the scale of destruction grew, the stage was set for the confrontation that would, before it was over, force an entire galactic civilization to confront the possibility that the species they had come to subjugate was not merely resilient or technologically capable, but something far more dangerous, an adversary, whose approach to war would render centuries of accumulated doctrine and experience suddenly and terrifyingly obsolete. And the activation of those hidden systems began not with a dramatic barrage, but with a subtle shift in the fabric of space itself, as regions of carefully seated micro-singularity projectors and gravitic distortion fields came online, warping local hyperspace boundaries and collapsing the precise navigation solutions on which the Korlathi formations depended, causing entire wings of their fleet to emerge from micro-jumps slightly out of alignment, their tight geometric order fraying by just enough to create gaps, overlaps, and momentary confusion in fire control coordination. And in those fractions of a second, when command algorithms struggled to resynchronize thousands of vessels, the first human deep strike units revealed their presence, not as a single mass, but as dozens of independent hunter groups, each operating under mission parameters that emphasize initiative over rigid hierarchy, their captains free to exploit opportunities as they arose. And they did so with weapons that the Dominion had cataloged only as theoretical, relativistic kinetic lances launched from extreme range, projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, carrying no energy signature until final moment of impact, punching through shields that were optimized to disperse coherent energy and fragmenting hulls with pure momentum that no defensive field could fully absorb. And as the first Korlathi battleships were cored through their central reactors, the shock within the armada was not simply tactical but conceptual, because their doctrine had long held that shield supremacy and layered energy defenses rendered such attacks inefficient and wasteful, a view now proven catastrophically wrong. And the supreme strategist, watching entire command nodes vanish in silent flashes, issued orders to tighten formations and concentrate fire on the newly detected human units, only to find that the distributed nature of those units made them difficult to pin down, each strike group dispersing after firing, slipping into pre-mapped corridors of distorted space that human navigation systems had learned to exploit but which confounded Dominion pursuit algorithms. And as the battle space grew increasingly chaotic, the second layer of the human plan unfolded. Autonomous drone swarms emerging from previously inert debris fields, each swarm composed of thousands of small, fast platforms carrying electronic warfare suites and precision munitions, flooding Korlathi. Sensor networks with false targets, decoys, and carefully crafted signal noise that mimicked the signatures of capital ships, forcing the Dominion's fire control systems to divide their attention and waste salvos on ghosts, while the real threats closed in from unexpected vectors. And in the midst of this, human-heavy units that had appeared to be in full retreat executed coordinated reversals, using the enemy's forward momentum to mask their turn, bringing broadside batteries to bear at ranges where their projectile and missile-based weapons achieved maximum lethality, saturating localized volumes of space with fire and patterns designed to overwhelm even the most robust point defense grids. And for the first time in the history of the Dominion, a major fleet engagement began to slip beyond the comfortable boundaries of prediction and control, and the supreme strategist's calm gave way to a tightening urgency as reports of system failures, communication delays, and unanticipated losses accumulated. And yet even then, he believed that sheer numerical superiority and the proven resilience of Korlathi capital ships would eventually grind down the defenders, that what he was witnessing was an innovative but ultimately unsustainable burst of resistance. And so he committed additional reserves, ordering the second and third echelons of the armada to press forward and envelop the human positions, a maneuver that in countless previous wars had sealed the fate of outmatched opponents. But as those massive formations moved to execute the encirclement, they crossed into regions of space where the density of human deployed autonomous platforms and concealed weapons reached a critical threshold, and in a sequence of detonations that lit the void with cascading flashes, entire swaths of the Dominion's advanced elements were subjected to synchronized minefield activations, not static devices anchored to predictable orbits, but mobile, networked weapons that repositioned themselves in real time based on enemy movement, forming dynamic kill zones that adjusted as the Korlathi attempted to maneuver, and the result was not a single devastating explosion but a rolling wave of destruction, ship after ship suffering catastrophic damage as overlapping shock fronts and kinetic impacts tore through formations that had no time to disperse or reorient. And in the command spire, the supreme strategist finally recognized that he was no longer dictating the flow of the battle, but reacting to it, and that the humans had not merely prepared defenses. They had constructed an environment of war tailored to dismantle the fundamental assumptions of Dominion doctrine. And as the casualty reports climbed into numbers that would have been unthinkable in previous campaigns, a realization began to take hold among the Korlathi leadership. A realization that the species they had come to subdue was not simply fighting for territory or prestige, but for survival, and that, in such a fight, they were willing to employ levels of planning, sacrifice, and adaptive violence that the Dominion, for all its power, had rarely needed to confront, and the balance of the engagement, once assumed to be permanently in their favor, was shifting in ways that would soon make retreat, once a theoretical contingency, an increasingly necessary consideration. And as the scale of losses became impossible to dismiss, the internal command channels of the Dominion filled with increasingly urgent requests for clarification and revised orders, subordinate fleet lords reporting that entire squadrons were being lost not in direct ship-to-ship duels, but to layered, interlocking fields of fire and disruption that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers before they were fully executed. And in the human command centers, this effect was no accident, because the battle was being guided by predictive models that integrated real-time sensor data with behavioral patterns extracted from centuries of Korlathi military history, allowing Terran strategists to project not only where the enemy would be, but how they would think, what formations they would default under pressure, and which tactical doctrines they would cling to even as those doctrines failed them. And this understanding was translated into a form of operational tempo that the Dominion had never faced, a rhythm of engagement in which every apparent opening was a lure, every retreat a setup, and every pause in fighting a prelude to a new and unexpected mode of attack. And when the Korlathi attempted to reestablish order by consolidating their remaining capital ships into tighter defensive clusters, human forces responded by shifting to weapons optimized for area denial and internal disruption, launching waves of penetrator munitions designed to burrow through outer armor and detonate within critical systems, accompanied by directed energy bursts tuned to overload shield harmonics rather than simply batter them down, a combination that forced the Dominion crews into a constant cycle of damage control and emergency rerouting, degrading their ability to coordinate and respond. And in several sectors of the battle space, entire Korlathi formations found themselves effectively blinded and isolated, their long-range sensors overwhelmed by electronic interference and their short-range systems clogged with debris and radiation, while human units, operating on redundant communication networks and autonomous command protocols, continued to maneuver and strike with cohesion. And it was in these moments that the psychological dimension of the conflict began to shift decisively as Korlathi officers, raised in a culture that equated order with strength and hierarchy with stability, struggled to comprehend an enemy that appeared comfortable with decentralization, that allowed individual commanders wide latitude to exploit fleeting opportunities, and that treated the chaos of battle not as a problem to be suppressed, but as a tool to be shaped and directed. And reports filtered up the chain of command of human ships pressing attacks, even when outnumbered, of units continuing their missions despite heavy damage, prioritizing the disruption of enemy command and logistics over their own immediate survival, and of coordinated sacrifices in which smaller vessels deliberately drew fire or triggered defensive systems to expose vulnerabilities for follow-on strikes, actions that did not fit neatly into the Dominion's calculus of cost and benefit, because they reflected a willingness to trade material and even lives for long-term strategic advantage in a way that assumed the war would be fought to its absolute conclusion, not merely to a negotiated settlement. And as the supreme strategist absorbed these developments, his initial confidence gave way to a more troubling assessment that the humans were not simply defending their space, but systematically dismantling the Dominion's ability to project power, targeting not just ships but the organizational and doctrinal foundations of their military. And this realization forced a reassessment of priorities, leading to orders to pull back certain formations, to consolidate around key command nodes, and to prepare contingency plans for a phased withdrawal if the situation continued to deteriorate, orders that would have been unthinkable at the outset of the campaign. And yet, as these directives were issued, they encountered delays and inconsistencies caused by the very disruptions the humans had engineered, and in several instances, retreating units found their escape routes cut off by newly activated human interdiction fields and fast-moving strike groups that had anticipated their vectors, turning what was intended as an orderly repositioning into a series of desperate breakouts. And in the wider galaxy, observers who had been monitoring the conflict through long-range sensors and intelligence networks began to register the shift as well, as data streams that initially showed a one-sided advance now revealed a growing imbalance in losses, a pattern of attrition that favored the supposedly weaker power, and whispers began to circulate among neutral and rival civilizations alike that something unprecedented was unfolding, that the Dominion, long considered an unstoppable force, was being checked and perhaps even outmatched by a species that had only recently stepped onto the interstellar stage. And as the battle for the Epsilon Eridani system raged on, expanding in scope and intensity, it became increasingly clear to all involved that this was no longer a limited campaign or a demonstration of strength, but the opening act of a confrontation that would redefine the strategic landscape of the galaxy and force a fundamental reevaluation of where true danger now resided. And within the core of the Korlathi command structure, the accumulating evidence of human effectiveness began to erode assumptions that had stood unchallenged for generations, as analysts compared projected outcomes with actual battlefield data and found widening gaps that could not be explained by chance or isolated innovation, revealing instead a systemic mismatch between Dominion doctrine and the operational reality the humans were creating. And this mismatch manifested most clearly in the way the Terran forces treated information as a weapon equal in importance to firepower, continuously probing, learning, and adapting in cycles measured in minutes rather than campaigns. And when Korlathi commanders attempted to introduce new tactical patterns to counter the asymmetric strikes and electronic disruptions, they found that the humans had already anticipated the likely adjustments and positioned assets accordingly, turning each attempted correction into another opportunity for exploitation. And in one critical sector of the battle space, a Dominion-heavy carrier group, tasked with providing fighter cover and command relay functions, was lured into what appeared to be a relatively quiet zone, only to find itself enveloped by a sudden convergence of human fast attack craft and long-range artillery platforms that had been masked by the complex sensor environment. And the ensuing engagement demonstrated with brutal clarity the human emphasis on targeting the connective tissue of an enemy force rather than its most heavily armored elements, as precision strikes disabled communication arrays, flight control centers, and power distribution hubs, leaving the massive carriers adrift and effectively blind, their fighter wings unable to coordinate or even receive updated orders. And as these keystone units were neutralized, the surrounding Dominion formations lost coherence, their response times lengthening, and their ability to mass firepower at decisive points diminishing. And in the Supreme Strategist's flagship, the battle map began to display expanding zones of uncertainty, areas where the exact disposition of forces could no longer be reliably determined, a condition that struck at the heart of Korlathi operational philosophy, which depended on comprehensive situational awareness and tightly synchronized action. And as that clarity dissolved, so too did the confidence that had underpinned the initial decision to invade. And yet, even in the face of mounting losses and growing confusion, the Dominion's institutional momentum drove the continuation of the offensive, a reflection of a culture that equated persistence with honor and withdrawal with weakness. And so additional reserves were committed, including elite formations that had previously been held back as a strategic safeguard. And these units, equipped with the most advanced technology the Dominion possessed and crewed by veterans of countless campaigns, entered the fray with the expectation that their presence would restore balance and impose order on the chaotic battle space. But their arrival only underscored the depth of the human preparation, because the Terran command had not only accounted for the possibility of such a reinforcement, it had designed specific countermeasures to neutralize it. And as the elite Dominion squadrons moved to engage what they believed to be the main concentration of human forces, they were instead drawn into a multi-layer engagement zone, where overlapping fields of kinetic, energy, and electronic attack converged. And in that crucible, even their superior shielding and firepower proved insufficient to offset the cumulative effects of constant disruption, precision targeting, and the relentless pressure of human units that refused to disengage even when the local balance of numbers was against them. And it was here that the character of the conflict became unmistakable, as reports from both sides described scenes of intense, close-range combat, human captains pushing their ships beyond nominal performance limits, rerouting power from life support to weapons and engines, accepting calculated risks that would have been considered reckless in more rigidly controlled fleets, while Dominion crews, accustomed to operating within well-defined parameters of safety and doctrine, struggled to adapt to an adversary that appeared willing to operate at the very edge of structural and human endurance. And as the hours stretched into days, the cumulative effect of these differences became stark, with human forces maintaining a level of operational tempo that the Dominion could not match, rotating damage units out of line, and replacing them with fresh ones drawn from a depth of reserves that had been quietly built up over years, while Korlathi, far from their home bases and operating at the limits of their logistical reach, found their ability to sustain losses and maintain readiness steadily eroding. And in the wider strategic picture, this imbalance began to translate into a shift in initiative as human task forces transitioned from reactive defense to proactive interdiction, striking at supply convoys, forward repair facilities, and command nodes that lay beyond the immediate battle zone, actions that further strained the Dominion's capacity to coordinate and reinforce its frontline units. And as these deep strikes took effect, the realization spread through the upper echelons of Korlathi, leadership that the campaign was no longer a simple matter of overwhelming a lesser foe, but a complex, escalating war against a species that had integrated technological innovation, psychological insight, and an unyielding commitment to survival into a coherent and highly effective approach to combat, an approach that was steadily turning the tables on a power that had long believed itself to be unassailable. And as the operational picture continued to deteriorate for the Dominion, the Supreme Strategist convened an emergency council with the surviving fleet lords, their communications carried over heavily encrypted channels that still flickered with intermittent interference from human electronic warfare. And in that council, the tone shifted from confident planning to stark assessment. Casualty figures were no longer abstract statistics, but represented the loss of irreplaceable veterans, specialized crews, and command experience that could not be rapidly regenerated. And projections showed that even if the immediate battle could be stabilized, the broader campaign would bleed the Dominion at a rate that threatened its long-term strategic position across the spiral arm. And this realization forced a consideration of options that had once been unthinkable, including the possibility that the objective of subjugating humanity might need to be abandoned in favor of containing and isolating it. And yet, even this more cautious approach was complicated by the fact that the humans were no longer content to fight defensively, but were actively shaping the conflict to expand its scope and in a coordinated series of operations that unfolded almost simultaneously across multiple fronts. Terran forces struck at the outer nodes of the Dominion's logistical network, targeting fuel depots, communication relays, and hyperspace gate infrastructure that supported not only the invasion fleet, but the broader system of Imperial control. And these strikes were executed with a level of precision and synchronization that revealed months, if not years, of prior reconnaissance and planning, suggesting that humanity had not merely reacted to the invasion, but had long anticipated the possibility of a confrontation with a major galactic power, and had quietly prepared the means to fight one on its own terms. And as report of these attacks reached the Dominion capital, the political leadership was confronted with the first real evidence that their expansionist policy had encountered a species capable of imposing unacceptable costs. And in emergency sessions of the High Council, debates erupted over whether the campaign should be escalated with the deployment of even more destructive weaponry, or curtailed to prevent further strategic overextension. And while these discussions unfolded, the situation at the front continued to evolve as human fleets, now operating with growing confidence, began to execute maneuvers that bordered on the audacious, penetrating deeper into contested space, engaging and destroying forward bases that had been considered secure, and demonstrating an ability to coordinate across vast distances with a level of resilience and redundancy that rendered traditional efforts at decapitation ineffective. And in one particularly telling engagement, a Dominion attempt to lure a human task force into a trap by feigning retreat was instead met with a layered counter-ambush, as Terran units allowed themselves to be drawn forward only to spring prepositioned interdiction fields and cross-fire from concealed artillery platforms, turning the tables and inflicting heavy losses on pursuing force. And this pattern, in which the humans consistently anticipated and inverted Dominion tactics, began to erode not only material strength but institutional confidence, as commanders who had built their careers on the reliability of established doctrine found themselves facing an adversary that treated doctrine as a flexible tool rather than a rigid framework. And as the psychological impact of this reversal spread, it became increasingly clear that the war was entering a new phase, one in which the initial assumptions of Korlathi's superiority had been thoroughly undermined, and the very identity of the Dominion, as the preeminent military power of its region, was being called into question. And for the first time in centuries, the possibility that they might not be able to impose their will through force alone was no longer a theoretical concern, but an emerging reality. And in the human command centers, where the flow of information and the tempo of operations remained relentless, this shift was recognized as the opening of a strategic window, an opportunity not merely to repel invasion, but to reshape the balance of power in the galaxy, and plans were set in motion to exploit this moment, to press the advantage in ways that would compel even the most entrenched opponents to reconsider their assessment of humanity. And as the conflict continued to escalate, the narrative that had once framed humans as a minor, developing species began to collapse under the weight of evidence, replaced by a growing recognition among allies, neutrals, and enemies alike that a new and formidable force had emerged, one whose approach to war combined adaptability, technological ingenuity, and an uncompromising will to survive, and whose actions were already rewriting the strategic calculus of an entire region of space. And as the cumulative weight of these developments pressed upon the Dominion's leadership, the final phase of the engagement at Epsilon Eridani began to take shape, not as a single decisive clash, but as a coordinated unraveling of the Korlathi operational structure as human forces, now firmly in control of the tempo, executed a sequence of actions designed to sever the remaining lines of cohesion within the invading armada, striking command ships with pinpoint accuracy, isolating formations from one another, and exploiting every delay and miscommunication to widen the gaps between units. And in the vacuum of space, where even seconds could determine the survival of thousands, those gaps became fatal, as unsupported vessels were overwhelmed in detail, their defensive systems saturated, and their crews forced to choose between futile resistance and desperate attempts to withdraw. And in the Supreme Strategist's flagship, the battle displays that had once shown orderly progress now flickered with warning indicators and loss reports that arrived faster than they could be processed. And for the first time in his long career, he was compelled to acknowledge that the enemy had not only matched but surpassed the Dominion's capacity for large-scale coordinated warfare, not through sheer numbers alone, but through an integrated approach that combined foresight, flexibility, and a ruthless understanding of how to dismantle a complex system by attacking its most vulnerable points. And as he issued the order for a general withdrawal to pre-designated fallback positions, an order that would have been considered unthinkable at the outset of the campaign, the response was fragmented, some units receiving it too late, others unable to execute due to damage or encirclement, and still others pressing on in isolated pockets of resistance, unwilling or unable to accept that the strategic initiative had been lost. And in those final hours of the battle, scenes of intense and often tragic combat unfolded across the system as Dominion ships fought to cover the retreat of their comrades, and human units, driven by a clear understanding of what was at stake, continued to apply pressure with relentless precision, cutting off escape routes, collapsing hyperspace corridors, and forcing the invaders to abandon not only territory, but confidence in their own invincibility. And when at last the surviving elements of the Korlathi armada broke contact and fell back beyond the effective reach of human interdiction, the field they left behind was strewn with the wreckage of hundreds of capital ships and countless smaller vessels, a silent testament to the scale of the confrontation and the cost of misjudgment. And in the aftermath, as damage assessments and casualty reports were compiled, the broader implications of what had occurred began to ripple outward through the galaxy, carried by intelligence channels, diplomatic envoys, an inevitable spread of rumor. And the narrative that took shape was not simply one of successful defense, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power, a recognition that humanity, once dismissed as a developing civilization on the fringes of greater empires, had demonstrated an ability to confront and defeat a dominant military force through a combination of preparation, adaptability, and an uncompromising resolve to control its own destiny. And for the Korlathi Dominion, the campaign that had been intended as a routine expansion had become a stark lesson, one that would be studied and debated for generations, about the dangers of underestimating a species whose history had forged it to thrive in conflict and whose response to existential threat was not submission, but the full, coordinated mobilization of its intellect, industry, and will, and as the dust of battle settled and the strategic picture was reassessed, one conclusion became inescapable to every observer, whether ally, neutral, or former adversary, that the humans had proven themselves not merely capable of defending their place among the stars, but of shaping the course of interstellar affairs through strength of arms and clarity of purpose, and that in the vast and often unforgiving arena of galactic politics and warfare, they had emerged as a species that could no longer be ignored, patronized, or casually challenged, but one that had earned a reputation, through the crucible of that battle, as the most dangerous kind of power, a civilization that learned quickly, struck decisively, and, when pushed to the brink, revealed a capacity for a coordinated, adaptive, and overwhelming force that would make every future contender think twice before ever again assuming that humanity was an easy target.